All right, I did want to just do a quick video on factoring because you have to be able to factor those denominators. So a couple things. I want to talk about difference of and sum of cubes. So if I had something like 27 minus 8x to the third in the denominator, and you were asked to factor that. When there's two terms and there's nothing common to those two terms, so first look for common factors, nothing common, then you need to look for the sum or difference of cubes or the difference of squares. And so those are both perfect cubes. 3 times 3 times 3 gives me 27, and 2x times 2x times 2x gives me 8x to the third. So when I go to factor this, one of my factors is going to be 3 minus, I use the same sign as what's in between here, so 3 minus 2x, and then I'm going to square this one, multiply those two together for my middle term, and square the last one. And I see that is my answer. So basically you have to figure out what the cubed roots are, and then it's a minus b, that's what this factor is, and then it's you square this one, you multiply those two together, and you square that one. So that's where I got a 9, a plus 6x, and a plus 4x squared. Now if that would have been, just to show you the difference with a sum of cubes, if that would have been a plus sign in here, we would have 3 plus 2x, so it's this base 3, and this base was 2x, and we use the plus sign in between, but then we're still going to square, but now the minus sign is going to go here for the middle term. Everything else stays the same. So difference of cubes, the minus sign goes here, sum of cubes, the minus sign goes there. Okay, so that's sum and difference of cubes. Let's talk about factoring by grouping. So let me give you one like that, let's say. And I want to factor by grouping. So I group the first two together. I take out an x squared. I'm left with an x plus 1. Look at the second two. I take out a negative 9. And what I just did is I went from 4 separate terms to now I have 2 terms. All of that because of the multiplication is one term, and so is that. Those two terms have something in common. They have an x plus 1 in common. So I write that down. That's my common factor. Open up a parenthesis. What's left? I'm left over here with an x squared when I take that away. Over here when I factor out the x plus 1, I'm left with a minus 9. And then don't forget, you always have to say, can I factor this any further? And yes, I can. This is the difference of perfect squares. So when you have perfect squares, both of those are perfect squares. When you factor it, it is x minus 3 and x plus 3. That's when it's the difference of squares. They're both perfect squares. It's x minus 3, x plus 3. Okay, so that's factoring by grouping. And then the last thing I want to talk about is what you do when you have something like, this, let's do a minus 12. I have something like that, and it's got 4 terms. Nothing's common to all 4. You can try to factor by grouping, but it's not going to give you anything where you've got that common factor that you can factor it. So that's when you have to use synthetic division. So let's talk about that. Remember, you're looking at this number here for the numerator, and the coefficient over here, which is a 1, for the denominator. So your possible roots, the numerator has to be a factor of 12. So it could be a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 6, or a 12. All of those are possibilities for the numerator. The denominator of your rational root has to be a factor of 1. So that's good. It only can be a 1. So we have to try plus and minus all of those possibilities. And I would suggest you always start with the smallest ones and work your way out. So when I see 1, I'll try 1 and negative 1 to get started. So let's try 1. You put the box there. 1 is my root, which means x minus 1 would be my factor. So if it works, then x minus 1 would be the factor. We put our coefficients, 1x to the third, 2x squared, negative 11 x's, and negative 12. So I draw a line, leave a space here. To get started, you bring down the 1 in your answer row, you multiply 1 times 1, put it in the next column, and add. 2 plus 1 is 3. Then you take that, 3 times 1 is 3, put it in the next column, and add those together. Negative 8 times 1, put it in the next column, and add. So this tells me there's a remainder of negative 20. So that is not a root then, there's a remainder. So let's try negative 1. Negative 1, 1, 2, negative 11, negative 12. Those are my coefficients again. So I bring down the 1. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. I add, I get 1. Multiply again, I get negative 1. Add, negative 12. Multiply by negative 1. Add, and I get 0. So this one does go in there evenly. So what does that mean? Well, because negative 1 is a root, one of my factors is going to be x plus 1. Again, because the root of that is negative 1. When I set that equal to 0, I would get negative 1 for a root. This is what's left after I factor that out. So I'm going to have a 1x squared plus an x minus 12. So I'm getting this factor from the fact that that's a root of negative 1, so x plus 1. And then what's left here is what I get when I factor out the x plus 1. I get a 1x squared plus 1x minus 12. And if you get mixed up like what should go here, like what power should that be? 1 what? X squared, x to the third. If you don't know, you can start backwards and say that's your number, that's your x term, and that's your squared term. So if you had another one in front of that, it would be your cube term. Okay, so then you have to decide, can that be factored? It's a quadratic, so now I would just draw my parentheses. X times x gets me x squared. Pair of factors of negative 12 would be a plus 4 and a minus 3, so that my middle term would be a 1x. So those would be all the factors. And if that were a partial fraction, we would take a over x plus 1 plus b over x plus 4 plus c over x minus 3 if we were writing that as a fraction. But right now I just wanted to focus on that division, that synthetic division, to make sure you knew how that worked. So you have to think of all the possible factors. Start small, so start with 1, negative 1, then try 2 and negative 2, and then once you get one that gives you a 0, once you get that 0, now you can go through and say, okay, that's a root, so now I know my factor, and then what's left down here is another factor. And if that can be simplified more or factored more, you need to do that as well. Okay, so those are really the big things I noticed when you guys were going through your worksheet. So I just wanted to do a quick factoring video on some of those issues, like the factoring by grouping, sum and difference of cubes, difference of squares, and then that synthetic division piece. So I hope that helped you a little bit.